The thermometer outside Tom Gardner's kitchen window read negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 9th, 1979. Inside his house, the reading was worse, 42 degrees and falling. His wood stove, a commercial cast-iron box he'd paid $230 for just 3 months earlier, roared with flames so fierce the metal glowed dull red along the seams. He'd fed it 7 logs in the past 4 hours. Oak logs, split thick, seasoned for 18 months. The heat rose straight up the pipe like water down a drain and vanished into the January sky. His children sat at the kitchen table wearing 3 layers under wool blankets. His wife Linda had stopped speaking 2 hours ago. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. The cold pressed against the windows like something alive. Something patient. The glass fogged with their breath and froze in fern patterns along the corners. The wind outside howled through the valley with a sound like tearing cloth. Tom loaded another log. The stove door clanged shut. He checked his woodpile on the porch. Half gone. It was only January 9th. Spring was 3 months away. 200 yards across the frozen dirt road that split their Montana valley, Anna Petrov sat at her kitchen table in a cotton dress and wool cardigan. No coat, no blankets. The air around her shimmered with warmth that rose from the white plastered bench running along her north wall. 30 feet of clay and stone, massive and silent. On the floor beside the small brick firebox sat the remains of a single log, burned down to white ash 6 hours ago. 1 log, 8 inches thick, 14 inches long. That was all. The room held 71 degrees. Her nearest neighbor would not know this for another 16 hours. When he did, when Tom Gardner finally crossed that frozen road in the early darkness before dawn, with his sick daughter wrapped in everything they owned, he would kneel on Anna's warm floor and press his palms flat against that bench and feel heat radiating from clay, and he would weep without shame. They had called her method ridiculous. They had called it primitive, backward, a waste of materials and dignity. Dale Benson at the hardware store had told her, in front of 4 other customers, that she would smoke herself out of her own house. Eleanor Marsh from the church had said it made the neighborhood look poor. Tom Gardner himself had explained, with patience and kindness, why the physics simply would not work. They were wrong. All of them. 9 months earlier, in April of 1978, Anna Petrov stood in the hardware section of Benson's General Supply in Kalispell and listened to a man explain why she would freeze to death. His name was Dale Benson, 3rd-generation owner. He'd sold heating equipment in Montana for 22 years. Before that, his father had run the same counter for 30. The walls behind him displayed cast-iron stoves, sheet metal chimneys, fireplace inserts, all gleaming and modern. Dale knew cold. He knew wood. He knew, with the absolute certainty that comes from repetition and profit, exactly what worked and what didn't. Anna had just described what she intended to build. Dale set down the invoice he'd been writing, removed his reading glasses, and looked at her with the expression a doctor might use before delivering bad news. "Ma'am, I'm telling you this as a courtesy and a neighbor. You cannot heat a house by burning wood sideways through mud." She had not used those exact words, but she understood his meaning. Her English still carried the thick corners of Hungarian consonants, and she often struggled to find the technical terms Americans used. What she had tried to explain was a design her grandfather had built in the hills outside Pécs, in southern Hungary, where winters came hard and fuel was scarce. A combustion chamber made of fire brick. A long horizontal channel running through clay mass. A bench that absorbed heat and held it the way a stone wall holds the afternoon sun. Dale picked up a pencil and sketched on the back of a parts receipt. He drew a box, then a line going sideways, then a question mark. Heat rises. That's physics. That's Newton. You need a vertical chimney to create draft. Without draft, You got no draw. Without draw, smoke backs up into your living space. He tapped the pencil against the question mark. What you're describing, with a horizontal flue running 30 feet under a bench before it goes vertical, that'll smoke you out of your house inside 10 minutes. You'll be outside choking while your furniture turns black. Anna said nothing. She had learned, in her 8 years in America, that arguing rarely changed minds. Facts did not persuade when identity was involved. She thanked him quietly and pointed to the fire clay on the shelf behind him. I need 60 pounds, and sand, and furnace cement, and 8 feet of stainless pipe, 6-inch diameter. Dale rang up the purchase with the slow deliberation of a man watching someone buy a shovel to dig their own grave. As she paid, he said, "You got family? Someone who can take you in come December?" "I will be fine." "Ma'am, I've seen people freeze. It's not peaceful. You don't just fall asleep. You suffer." Anna met his eyes. She was 53 years old. Her hands were calloused from gardening. Her face was lined from sun and loss. She did not look away. "I will be fine," she repeated. She loaded the materials into the bed of her 1968 Ford pickup, the one her husband had bought, used the year before his heart gave out, and drove home in silence. Tom Gardner heard about it 3 days later at the post office. His wife Linda mentioned, while sorting through mail, that the widow across the road was building something strange in her house. Something with mud and rocks. Mary Kowalski, who lived a mile south, had driven past and seen Anna unloading river stones from her truck. Tom was a practical man. He ran a small cattle ranch, kept his equipment running with wire and stubbornness, and measured value by function, not appearance. He'd rebuilt transmissions on his kitchen table. He understood systems. He walked over that evening after feeding, not to interfere, but to understand. Anna's living room had been emptied. The furniture sat on the covered porch under tarps, the sofa and chairs arranged like they were waiting for a house that no longer existed. In the center of the room, she had constructed a firebox from red brick, about 2 feet tall and 18 inches square. The bricks were mortared with furnace cement, each joint tight and deliberate. Next to the firebox, a trench ran along the north wall, 3 feet wide and 18 inches deep, lined with river stones the size of bread loaves. Buckets of grey clay sat against the far wall, wet and heavy. Tom studied the setup for a long moment, tracing the logic. "You're building a stove." "Yes." "Out of mud, clay, and stone, and brick for the combustion box where the fire burns." He pointed at the trench. "And that's your chimney?" "It will run under a bench, 30 feet along the wall, then up through the exterior wall to outside." Tom did the math in his head. 30 feet of horizontal flue, no immediate draft, smoke heavier than air in cold conditions. "Anna, I don't mean to overstep, and I respect what you're trying to do, but that's not going to work. Smoke needs to rise. That's why chimneys are vertical. It's not tradition. It's thermodynamics." She pressed a layer of clay between 2 stones, her hands steady and methodical. "It will work." "How? What creates the draft?" "The fire burns very hot in the small chamber, hotter than a normal stove. The heat itself pushes the smoke through the channel. By the time the smoke reaches the end, it has given all its heat to the clay. The clay holds the heat, releases it slow, for many hours." Tom had repaired enough diesel engines and hydraulic systems to recognize a fundamental misunderstanding of thermodynamics when he heard it. Heat didn't push smoke. Pressure differentials caused by temperature gradients created convection currents, and those currents required vertical space to establish flow. Horizontal runs worked in forced air systems with blowers, not passive combustion. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to be difficult, but smoke doesn't move because it's hot. It moves because hot air is less dense than cold air, so it rises. If you run it sideways through 30 feet of clay, it'll stall. It'll back up into your house. You'll have smoke in every room. Anna placed another stone, pressed clay into the gap, smoothed it with her thumb. In my grandfather's village, in Hungary, many houses had these. Everywhere. Every house. They burned one log in morning, one log in evening. The houses stayed warm all day and all night, even when snow was taller than a man. Tom softened his voice. He liked Anna. She kept to herself, worked her garden from dawn to dusk in summer, never asked for help even when it was clear she needed it. He didn't want to see her hurt. Things might have been different where you're from. Different climate, different wood, I don't know. But Montana winter is no joke. Last year we hit -35. That cast iron stove in my house, that's rated for -40. It's got baffles, a damper, welded steel plate. I still go through 2 full cords of wood every winter, and there are nights I'm cold. You're going to need a real heating system. Something proven. She thanked him. Her voice was polite, final. She kept working. Tom walked home as the sun set behind the mountains, the sky turning the color of a bruise. He told Linda that Anna was making a mistake, but that some people had to learn the hard way. Linda, who had grown up on a ranch and understood stubbornness as a survival trait, said, "She made it 8 years alone. Maybe she knows something." Tom didn't argue, but he made a mental note to check on her come December. The mechanism that Anna Petrov was building in the spring of 1978 would later be called a rocket mass heater by the engineers and permaculturists who studied and refined it, though that specific term would not appear in American alternative building literature until 1984, popularized by Ianto Evans and Leslie Jackson. The principles, however, were ancient. Archaeologists had documented nearly identical designs in Korean homes dating to the Goguryeo period, around the 4th century. They called it ondol, heated stone. The Romans had used hypocaust systems, though those relied on external furnaces and slave labor to maintain continuous fires. The specific combination Anna remembered, a vertical combustion chamber feeding a horizontal thermal mass in a single integrated unit, had evolved in Central and Eastern Europe over centuries of cold winters, scarce wood, and the kind of practical innovation that happens when survival depends on efficiency. The physics that made it work were invisible but absolute. First, combustion efficiency. Anna built the firebox small, barely larger than the wood it would contain, 18 inches square, 2 feet tall. She lined it with fire brick, which reflected heat inward. When wood burns in a conventional stove with a large firebox, it combusts at temperatures between 400 and 700 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, much of the smoke, the visible brown particulate matter, is unburned fuel. Complex hydrocarbons, creosote, carbon monoxide. It escapes up the chimney, wasting energy and coating the flue with residue. In Anna's design, the small chamber and the insulating brick forced the fire into an extremely confined space. Air entered from below through a gap she'd measured at exactly 3 inches, creating a Venturi effect. The incoming air accelerated, mixing turbulently with the fire. The flames couldn't spread outward, only upward, concentrating heat. The temperature climbed, 900 degrees, 1,000, 1,100. At those temperatures, the smoke itself ignited. Secondary combustion. The hydrocarbons burned. What emerged from the firebox was not smoke but superheated gas, nearly transparent, almost pure carbon dioxide and water vapor. Second, heat extraction. In a conventional chimney, hot gas rises vertically and escapes into the atmosphere. The system is simple, reliable, and enormously wasteful. 60% of the energy goes up the pipe. In Anna's design, the superheated gas had nowhere to go but sideways, through the horizontal channel she was building. The channel was 6 inches tall and 8 inches wide, lined with stone and buried in clay. As the gas traveled through that channel, moving not because it rose, but because the intense heat and pressure in the firebox pushed it forward. It surrendered its thermal energy to the mass surrounding it. Clay has a specific heat capacity of 0.22 kilocalories per kilogram per degree Celsius. It heats slowly. It cools slowly. Stone is similar. Together they act as a thermal battery. The gas entered the channel at over 1,000 degrees. By the time it reached the end, 30 feet later, it had dropped to less than 200 degrees, cool enough to touch the pipe. All that energy, all that heat, remained in the mass. Third, radiant heat delivery. Once the clay was hot, it radiated warmth into the room at a rate determined not by the fire, which might burn for only an hour, but by the temperature differential between the mass and the surrounding air. The bench became a slow-release heating element, like a massive radiator that needed no electricity, no pumps, no moving parts. It delivered heat for 12, 15, sometimes 18 hours after the fire went out. To someone like Dale Benson, who had sold metal stoves with conventional chimneys for 2 decades, the design looked primitive and flawed. To someone like Tom Gardner, who understood engines and hydraulics but not ceramic thermal dynamics, it looked like a misunderstanding of basic physics. To Anna Petrov, who had slept on a bench like this as a child in Hungary, who remembered the smell of the clay and the feeling of warmth soaking through a wool blanket at midnight when the fire had been out for hours, it looked like survival. She worked alone. The construction took 6 weeks of hard labor. Her hands cracked from the clay. The wet material leached moisture from her skin, leaving her palms rough and split. She wore gloves, but they made the work clumsy, so she abandoned them. At night, she rubbed lard into the cracks and wrapped her hands in cloth. Her shoulders ached from lifting stone. Each river stone weighed between 15 and 30 pounds. She carried them from her truck to the trench, one at a time, 57 stones in total. She was not a large woman. 5 feet 4 inches, 130 pounds. Her back complained. She ignored it. She made mistakes. The first layer of clay, mixed too wet and applied too thick, dried too fast in the May sun. It cracked, fissures running through it like lightning. She stared at those cracks for an hour, exhausted and angry, then tore the entire layer out with a pry bar and started again. This time she added sand for flexibility and chopped straw for tensile strength. The mixture dried slower, stronger. The combustion chamber required precision. The fire brick had to be laid with joints no wider than 1/8 of an inch. Air leaks would destroy the draft, allowing smoke to escape into the room. She cut each brick with a masonry saw, measured twice, laid it once. The work was slow. Her knees ached from kneeling. The furnace cement smelled like sulfur and made her eyes water. The horizontal channel, the flue that would carry the heat through the mass, had to maintain consistent dimensions. 6 inches of height, no more, no less. If it was too large, the gas would slow and cool prematurely. If it was too small, it would create back pressure and stall the draft. She built a wooden template and checked every foot of the channel against it. There were moments, alone in the empty room with plaster dust in her hair and clay under her fingernails, when she doubted. She was 53 years old. Her husband, Joseph, had died 2 winters ago. Heart attack, sudden and absolute, while he cleared snow from the roof. She had found him at the base of the ladder, his face blue, his eyes open. The funeral cost $300. She had no children. Her nearest relative, a cousin, lived in Cleveland and sent a Christmas card every other year. She had $418 in savings at the First National Bank of Kalispell. The small pension from Joseph's 30 years working for Burlington Northern Railroad covered property tax, vehicle insurance, and little else. She grew vegetables in summer. She canned everything. She traded eggs from her 6 chickens for flour at the general store. The wood on her property was limited. Cottonwood and aspen, fast-growing and weak, terrible for heating. A cord of seasoned pine or oak, delivered, cost $90. She could afford perhaps 3 cords, maybe 4 if she didn't fix the truck's brakes. In a conventional stove, 3 cords might last until February if she burned carefully and wore a coat indoors. She had no margin for error, no backup plan, no money for a second chance. The mechanism had to work. She kept building. At church on the first Sunday in September, Eleanor Marsh approached Anna after the service. Eleanor was 68, a widow herself, and one of the unelected pillars of the community. She organized the church bake sales, led the ladies' auxiliary, and had strong, clearly articulated opinions about propriety and tradition. Her husband had been a lawyer. She lived in a house with central heating. "I heard you've built some kind of oven in your living room," Anna corrected her gently. "A heater for winter. Made of mud and rocks. Clay and stone, yes." Eleanor's mouth tightened in the way that signaled disapproval wrapped in concern. "Dear, I understand you come from a different background, a different culture. But there are certain standards in this country. Modern standards. We have technology now. Central heating. Thermostats. We don't live like peasants anymore." Anna had heard variations of this sentiment before, not just from Eleanor but from others. That America was advanced. That old methods were backward, embarrassing. That assimilation meant abandoning the past, adopting the new, even when the new was expensive and wasteful. She did not argue. She had learned that arguments about method were never really about method. They were about identity, about who belonged and who didn't. She simply said, "It will keep me warm." A proper furnace would keep you warm, or at least a decent wood stove from Benson's. What you've built, it's unseemly. It makes the neighborhood look poor. Anna's house sat on 12 acres at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud in spring and froze into ruts in winter. Her nearest neighbor was Tom Gardner, 200 yards away. The next house after that was half a mile. The concept of neighborhood appearance was abstract to her, but she understood the deeper message. Eleanor was uncomfortable with difference, with methods that looked foreign, handmade, non-commercial. Anna said, "I will plaster the bench smooth. Paint it white. It will look very nice, like a window seat." Eleanor sighed the way a teacher sighs at a stubborn child. "That's not the point, Anna." But it was exactly the point. Anna had learned that for some people, the appearance of correctness, the surface compatibility with accepted norms, mattered more than the function underneath. Eleanor didn't care if Anna froze. She cared that Anna's solution didn't come from a store. Anna thanked her for her concern and walked to her truck. The mechanism was completed in late October. The bench ran along the entire north wall, 30 feet long, 3 feet wide, 18 inches tall. She plastered it smooth with a final coat of fine clay mixed with lime, then painted it white. It looked, as she'd promised Eleanor, like a built-in seating area. Clean. Intentional. She sewed cushions from fabric remnants and placed them on top. Underneath, invisible, 4,000 pounds of clay and stone held the memory of her hands. Anna lit the first test burn on October 23rd, 1978. She used kindling, dry pine splits, and a single log of oak. The log was 8 inches in diameter, 14 inches long, dried for 2 years. It weighed maybe 6 pounds. She crouched beside the combustion chamber, watching through the small opening. The kindling caught. Yellow flames. Smoke rose into the chamber, brown and lazy. For 30 seconds, nothing changed. Then the chamber temperature reached critical mass. The smoke stopped rising and started moving horizontally, pulled by the pressure. Then it ignited. The flame turned from orange to white. A roaring torch. The sound changed, from the crackle of wood to a deep, throated hum, like wind in a pipe, like breath through a flute. No smoke entered the room. She watched for 10 minutes, then stood and walked to the far end of the bench, near the exit chimney. She placed her hand on the clay. Warm. Definitely warm. She walked back to the middle. Warm. She sat on a cushion and waited. The log burned for 43 minutes, fast and complete. When the flame died, only ash remained in the firebox. White ash, powdery, like talc. No chunks of charcoal, no half-burned wood. Complete combustion. She sat on the bench for the rest of the afternoon, reading a book in Hungarian that she'd read 4 times already. Every hour, she checked the temperature with her hand. 4 hours after the fire went out. Warm. 6 hours. Still warm. 8 hours. Cooling, but still warmer than the ambient air. The room, which was small and reasonably insulated, held 68 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 41. 1 log. 6 pounds of wood. 8 hours of heat. She sat in the silence of her empty living room and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to believe it might work. November came cold. The forecast called for an early winter. The Farmer's Almanac, which Tom Gardner trusted more than the National Weather Service, predicted record lows and heavy snow. In town, people bought extra kerosene for backup heaters. Dale Benson sold 14 wood stoves in 3 weeks, more than he'd sold in the previous 2 years combined. Anna burned 1 log in the morning at 6, 1 log in the evening at 6, 12 hours apart. The room stayed between 65 and 72 degrees. She used 8 logs per week, sometimes 9 if the night was particularly cold. At that rate, her 3 cords would last not until February, but until the following November, an entire year. Maybe longer. Tom noticed the smoke from her chimney, or rather, the lack of it. On a still, cold morning in late November, when every other house in the valley sent thick grey plumes into the air, Anna's chimney produced only a faint shimmer, almost invisible, like heat rising from summer asphalt. He mentioned it to Linda over breakfast. She can't be burning much. Either that, or she's freezing in there and too stubborn to admit it. Linda, who had visited Anna once in early November to drop off a casserole after church, said, "She was comfortable when I was there. Warmer than we are, actually. I almost took my sweater off." Tom frowned. That didn't make sense. The mathematics didn't work. You couldn't heat a house in Montana with almost no wood. But he let it go. Maybe she had a propane heater she wasn't mentioning. Maybe she was burning coal in addition to wood. He had his own problems. Feed prices were up. One of his cows was sick. Winter was coming. The cold arrived in December like an invading army. On December 8th, the temperature dropped to -12. On December 15th, -22. On January 3rd, -27. The wind came straight from Canada, across the plains, unobstructed and vicious. It found every gap in every wall, every poorly sealed window, every crack in every foundation. It howled through the valley at night with a sound like wolves, like freight trains, like the end of something. Tom's wood stove burned day and night. He loaded it every 3 hours, setting an alarm for 2 in the morning so the fire wouldn't die. Oak, pine, split, thick and dry. The flames roared. The stove glowed. The heat rose straight up the chimney pipe, and the house stayed cold. His 7-year-old daughter, Emily, developed a cough the week after Christmas. Nothing serious at first, just a dry cough that wouldn't stop. The doctor in Kalispell said, "Keep her warm, keep her hydrated, watch for fever." Tom kept the stove loaded. The room temperature hovered around 55 degrees. Emily wore 2 sweaters and a coat indoors. The cough got worse. On the night of January 10th, 1979, the temperature fell to -31 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold at that temperature is not simply uncomfortable. It is physiologically hostile. Exposed skin freezes in under 4 minutes. Breath crystallizes instantly into clouds of ice that hang in the air. Vehicles will not start. Batteries die. Pipes burst. Conventional wood stoves, even expensive cast iron models rated for extreme cold, struggle to maintain interior temperatures above 50 degrees when the exterior air is that hostile and the wind is blowing 30 miles per hour. Tom burned 9 logs between sunset and midnight. He burned 6 more between midnight and 3 in the morning. He stood in front of the stove in his coat, feeding it constantly, watching the thermometer on the wall fall. 48 degrees, 45, 41. Emily's cough turned into something else. Her breathing became shallow, labored. She shivered under 4 blankets, her face pale. Linda held her and cried silently. Tom stood at the window, looking across the frozen road at Anna's house. A single light glowed in her window. He made a decision. At 5:30 in the morning, with the sky still black and the wind screaming, he wrapped Emily in every piece of fabric they owned. 2 blankets, a sleeping bag, his own coat over hers. He carried her across the frozen road, his boots cracking through the surface ice, his breath a cloud that froze on his beard. He knocked on Anna Petrov's door, and heat spilled out like water, like summer, like salvation. Anna opened the door in her cotton dress and cardigan, her face calm, and Tom stumbled inside with his daughter in his arms. He could not speak for a moment. The shock of warmth was physical, disorienting, almost painful. His face burned as the skin thawed. His hands ached. Emily, in his arms, stopped shivering. Anna did not ask questions. She understood immediately. She took Emily gently from his arms and laid her on the bench, on the cushions, on the mass of heated clay. The child's eyes closed. Her breathing deepened, smoothed. Color returned to her cheeks. Tom stood in the center of the room, unable to process what he was feeling. The air was still, soft, warm. Not the harsh, dry heat of forced air or the sharp, radiant heat of a roaring stove. This was different, gentle, even, like being held. He walked to the bench and placed both hands flat on the painted surface. It was hot, not burning, but deeply, thoroughly hot. He looked at the combustion chamber. A small flame flickered inside, barely the size of a candle. On the floor beside it sat the charred end of a log, mostly burned. That was all. No roaring fire, no glowing metal, just clay and heat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "How?" he whispered. Anna brought a quilt and covered Emily. "1 log at 5 this morning, 1 log at 6 last night. That is all I use." Tom's mind, trained in mechanics and systems, tried to find the trick. There had to be a trick. A hidden propane line, an electric element, something. You could not heat a house to 70 degrees in negative 31-degree weather with 2 logs per day. It violated every principle he understood about thermodynamics, heat loss, and BTU requirements. But his daughter was warm. The room was warm. The evidence was absolute and irrefutable. "The clay," Anna said softly, sitting in a chair across from him. "It holds the heat. The fire burns very hot, very clean in the small box. Nothing is wasted. All the heat goes into the mass. The mass gives it back slowly for many hours. The system is patient." Tom ran the math in his head. 2 logs per day, 14 logs per week. He was burning 70, maybe 80 logs per week, and his house was still cold. The ratio was impossible. But it was true. He sat on the floor beside the bench, his hand on his daughter's back, feeling her breathe, and he cried. By noon, 3 more families had crossed the road. Word spread in the way it does in rural places, through phone calls and desperation. Linda told Mary Kowalski. Mary told her brother-in-law. By 2 in the afternoon, Anna's small living room held 9 people, including 2 infants. She served coffee. She explained the system again and again. She drew diagrams on paper with a pencil. Dale Benson arrived at 3 in the afternoon, driving slowly through the cold. He stood in her doorway for a full minute, saying nothing, just feeling the air. Then he walked to the bench, took off his glove, and placed his palm on the clay. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked at Anna and said, "I was wrong." Anna offered him coffee. "I was completely wrong," he said again. "I've been selling stoves for 22 years. My father before me for 30, and I was wrong." He sat on the bench, this man who had mocked her, and asked her to explain it again. She did. The physics, when later explained by engineers from the Montana Department of Energy, and years after that, by researchers studying efficient heating systems, were simple in principle and profound in application. Anna's design achieved thermal efficiency close to 90%. A conventional wood stove, with its large firebox and straight vertical chimney, achieved perhaps 60% on a good day. 40% of the energy, maybe more, escaped as heat loss and unburned particulate matter. In Anna's system, the small insulated combustion chamber created temperatures sufficient for secondary combustion. At those temperatures, nearly all the hydrocarbons burned. The long thermal mass absorbed energy that would otherwise escape up a chimney. The mass then released that energy at a rate determined not by the intensity of the fire, but by the temperature differential between the mass and the surrounding air. It was a battery. It was a time-release mechanism. It was, in the language that would emerge a decade later in the sustainable building movement, a thermal flywheel. It was also a design that looked absolutely absurd to anyone trained in conventional American heating systems. It violated expectations. It challenged the commercial logic that said efficiency required expensive materials and professional installation. And it worked better than anything anyone in that valley had ever used. Tom Gardner rebuilt his heating system that February. He used Anna's design, scaling it slightly for his larger space. He laid fire brick with his own hands. He hauled river stones. He mixed clay. Anna visited twice to check his work, correcting the dimensions of the combustion chamber, explaining the importance of a tight seal. His first burn was on February 28th. The system worked. His wood consumption dropped by 70%. His house stayed warmer. His children stopped wearing coats indoors. Dale Benson, humbled and genuinely curious, began sketching plans in a notebook. He didn't sell the plans. He gave them away. By March, 4 more households in the valley had constructed clay mass heaters. By the following winter, the design had spread to Kalispell, to Whitefish, to Columbia Falls, to small towns across Montana, where winters were brutal and wood was expensive. Anna became, quietly and without seeking it, a person people visited. Not for fame, not for money, for knowledge. She explained the principles carefully. The combustion chamber must be small and heavily insulated. The mass must be substantial, at least 3,000 pounds for a medium-sized room. The channel must be properly sealed, with no air leaks. She drew diagrams on paper bags at her kitchen table. She visited construction sites and corrected mistakes. She refused payment every time. Eleanor Marsh never apologized, but in October of 1979, she attended a demonstration at Tom Gardner's house. She watched Anna light a fire in Tom's new system. When the smoke ignited in the chamber and the deep roar began and no smoke entered the room, Eleanor went silent. Her face showed something between confusion and the discomfort of being proven wrong. She left without speaking, but 3 weeks later, she sent Anna a card thanking her for sharing her knowledge with the community. It was as close to an apology as Anna would receive, and she accepted it. In the spring of 1984, a researcher named Michael Korda from the Montana Department of Energy heard about the systems through a colleague. He drove to the valley and asked to measure Anna's heater. She agreed. He used data loggers, temperature probes, combustion analyzers. He calculated fuel consumption over a 2-week period in March. when nighttime temperatures still dropped below 20. He compared the data to conventional heating systems in similar-sized homes. Anna's design used 83% less wood for equivalent heat output. He asked if he could publish the data in a state report. She said yes. The report, titled Thermal Mass Heating Systems in Extreme Cold Climates, a Case Study in Rural Montana, was filed in the Department of Energy Archives in Helena. It was read by 62 people, mostly engineers and a few architects. It was cited in 3 academic papers. It changed heating codes in 2 counties, allowing for alternative systems that met efficiency standards without conforming to conventional designs. It did not make Anna famous. She preferred it that way. The winter of 1979 remained, for decades, one of the coldest in Montana history. Livestock died across the state. Vehicles were abandoned on highways. Schools closed for weeks. In the valley where Anna lived, 14 families survived largely because of knowledge she shared freely. The mechanism that saved them was not a product of modern invention or technological breakthrough. It was a memory, carried across an ocean in the mind of a Hungarian widow, built by hand from materials as old as civilization itself. It looked ridiculous to people who had never been cold enough to need it. It worked. Anna Petrov died in her sleep in April of 1996 at the age of 71. Her house was sold to a couple from California who tore out the clay bench 6 months later to install radiant floor heating. They did not understand what they were removing. The clay was hauled away in a dumpster. But the knowledge did not die with Anna. By 2012, a movement called rocket mass heaters had appeared in permaculture communities, sustainable living forums, and off-grid homesteading networks across North America and Europe. Thousands of people, many of them entirely unaware of Anna's story or the Hungarian tradition she carried, began building designs nearly identical to hers. They posted plans online. They taught workshops in barns and backyards. They wrote books. They refined the engineering, testing different mass materials, optimizing combustion chamber dimensions, measuring emissions. The mechanism, proven in the frozen valleys of Montana 40 years earlier by a woman working alone, became part of the global lexicon of resilient living. Engineers now understand precisely why it works. The small combustion chamber creates temperatures above 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, sufficient for complete secondary combustion of smoke particulates. The thermal mass, typically between 3,000 and 6,000 pounds, creates a time-delay heat delivery system that decouples heat production from heat delivery. The result is efficiency that approaches the theoretical maximum for solid fuel combustion. But in January of 1979, in the dark hours before dawn, the understanding came differently. It came when Tom Gardner knocked on a door with his dying daughter in his arms and felt warmth spill out into the killing cold. It came when Dale Benson stood in a room heated by mud and clay and admitted that his certainty had been empty. It came when Eleanor Marsh watched a fire burn through smoke and realized that propriety meant nothing when winter came. It came when a Hungarian widow mocked and doubted and dismissed, burned a single log, and turned it into a full day of warmth. History is written by those who prepare, by those who remember what worked when systems failed and certainty collapsed, by those willing to look foolish in September so they might survive in January. The neighbors laughed at her ridiculous clay stove. They stopped laughing when the cold came. If preserving knowledge like this matters to you, if you believe that practical wisdom should outlast trends and convenience and the arrogance of assumed progress, subscribe to this channel. Share this story. The next winter is always coming, and the skills that matter most are the ones that look absurd until the moment you need them. Anna Petrov understood this. She built her answer from clay and patience and the memory of her grandfather's hands. She burned one log a day and stayed warm while the world froze. She did not argue. She did not defend. She did not seek validation or approval. She simply worked. And when the test came, when the temperature fell to -31 and the wind tore through the valley like a wolf, her mechanism passed. The cold was absolute. The physics were absolute. The warmth was absolute. That is how survival works. Not with what sounds correct or what looks modern or what comes from a store with a warranty, but with what functions when certainty fails and the temperature falls, and the only thing standing between you and the long night is what you built with your own hands from the oldest materials on earth. Clay, stone, fire, time, one log a day. That was enough.